At sunrise, 24 armed guards blocked every road into Kingsridge Preserve, while HOA President Vanessa Crowley watched from a velvet chair above the clubhouse steps. She called it martial law. Residents called it madness. Phones were confiscated, gates were chained, and Grant Holloway was ordered to surrender the private road reservoir and power station on his land. Vanessa believed money, uniforms, and fear had made her untouchable. But when Grant quietly opened a steel evidence box, sirens rolled across the ridge. Minutes later, state troopers surrounded her guards, climbed the clubhouse stairs, and pulled Vanessa from the throne she had built. At 5:40 in the morning, Grant Holloway drove his truck down the private road that connected his ranch house to the highway, leading into town, the way he had done 1,000 mornings before, but this time 3 black sport utility vehicles sat parked across the road like a wall. Men in tactical uniforms were stringing steel barricades and portable spotlights across the pavement, unspooling coils of razor wire as if they were preparing for a siege rather than a quiet Montana morning. Grant counted 6 men at the north gate alone, and through the static of a handheld radio clipped to one man's vest, he heard chatter about matching teams stationed at the east gate, the south gate, and the clubhouse. By the time he had parked and stepped out, he understood that Kingsridge Preserve had been sealed by 24 hired guards working under a single chain of command. A man built like a linebacker walked toward him, introduced himself as Troy Bannister, and demanded that Grant shut off his engine, step down, and produce identification, handing him a laminated order, stamped with the Kingsridge Preserve Homeowners Association seal that declared the entire community under a state of civil emergency. The order claimed, sweeping powers, every road sealed, every vehicle searched, the property rights of the neighboring landowner, suspended the reservoir, and the power substation seized for community use, filming banned, and any resistance treated as a threat to public safety. Grant read it twice and realized this was not a dispute over fences or paint colors anymore. Vanessa Crowley was attempting to manufacture a government of her own on land she did not own. The order was printed on official-looking letterhead, complete with a raised seal that mimicked county stationery, closely enough to fool anyone who had never actually dealt with the county clerk's office. And beneath the seal sat a line demanding that all residents and adjacent landowners acknowledge the emergency by nightfall or face escalating consequences. When Grant refused to abandon his truck, Troy rested a hand on the stun gun at his belt and warned him that continued defiance would result in detention, but Grant said nothing further, turned his truck around, and quietly activated a second dashboard camera hidden behind his rearview mirror before he drove away, noting the exact positions of every guard and vehicle he passed along the way. Back at his ranch house, he retrieved a pair of binoculars and watched the clubhouse from a rise above his property, and there on the front steps sat Vanessa Crowley in a red velvet chair with gilded armrests, positioned above the crowd like a queen surveying her subjects, a banner strung behind her, reading, "Emergency Authority Kingsridge Protection Command." The fabric still bearing creases from whatever storage box it had been pulled out of overnight, as though she had been waiting for an excuse to unveil it for months. Through a bullhorn, she announced that she had declared martial law to protect the community from outside saboteurs, and everyone within earshot understood exactly who she meant, since Grant's name had been whispered through the neighborhood group chats for weeks, as the outsider threatening their safety and their property values. Grant was the saboteur simply because he owned the road that led out of the development, the reservoir that fed it water, and the small substation that kept its lights on during storms. Within an hour, Grant discovered his landline had gone dead, and the nearest cell tower was returning, nothing but static, a jamming pattern he recognized from his years designing transportation infrastructure for the state. His property, his home, and everything he had inherited from his family before Kingsridge Preserve had ever broken ground had effectively been cut off from the outside world by a woman with no legal authority beyond managing homeowner dues and landscaping violations. He walked into his study, opened a locked drawer beneath his desk, and pulled out plat maps, deed records, and a steel evidence box he had assembled over many months of watching Vanessa's ambitions grow. Sitting at his desk with the box open before him, he said quietly to the empty room that she had not declared martial law at all. She had just committed an armed land grab in broad daylight, and now there would be a record of every second of it. He had spent years working as a transportation infrastructure engineer for the state, before retiring to run the ranch full-time, and that background had taught him one lesson above all others. Agencies with real authority never needed to invent theatrical titles or velvet furniture to prove they were in charge, and anyone who did was almost always compensating for the fact that they had none. 3 years earlier, Vanessa Crowley had been elected HOA president on a platform of lower dues and rising property values, and for a while her reign seemed harmless, limited to disputes about the acceptable shade of blue for a front door or the permitted height of a backyard fence. Slowly, though, the association under her leadership transformed into something closer to a surveillance state, with a private company hired to track license plates at every entrance. Cameras mounted on every light pole, a so-called special compliance committee formed to investigate violations, fines, climbing into the thousands of dollars attorneys retained to threaten dissenting homeowners in closed-door meetings where no minutes were ever published. Grant Holloway had never belonged to that association since his family had owned their 1,860 acres, long before Kingsridge Preserve existed. But 3 pieces of his land sat uncomfortably close to the development's borders. A single fire access road wide enough for heavy engines, a reservoir licensed for agricultural and emergency use, and a small substation that supplied backup power to the entire valley. Every resident who had lived there long enough understood that without those 3 assets, Kingsridge Preserve would have never survived its first harsh winter. Since the developers had built the community relying on infrastructure they never bothered to formally secure, assuming a handshake agreement with Grant's late father would hold indefinitely. Vanessa had repeatedly offered to buy all 3 at a fraction of their worth, intending to convert them into toll assets for her association. And Grant had refused every time because he understood exactly what she planned to do with them. Her campaign against him escalated in stages that felt petty until they didn't forged. HOA invoices mailed to his address signs erected falsely, claiming his road belonged to the community unauthorized survey crews sent onto his land. Padlocks cut from his gates threatening letters implying eventual seizure of his property and public accusations that he was blocking residents' rightful access. At one homeowners meeting, Vanessa had gone so far as to project a slide showing Grant's property boundary redrawn to include the reservoir and half his fire road, presenting it to residents, as though the change were already finalized rather than a fantasy she intended to force into reality. Every time Grant answered with legal filings that dismantled her claims until 2 weeks before the blockade, he discovered that the association had entered private negotiations with a resort development corporation planning to buy rights to his reservoir and his road in order to build a mountain resort. Without his land, the entire $38 million deal would collapse, and Vanessa needed to seize control of it before the corporation's inspection team arrived. That single fact explained everything. The timing of the blockade, the sudden arrival of 24 hired guards, and the desperate urgency behind a homeowners association suddenly declaring martial law over land it had no legal claim to. While Grant sat reviewing his files, a familiar voice crackled through an old handheld radio he kept charged for emergencies, and Nadine Holt, a former local reporter who lived inside Kingsridge Preserve, whispered that Vanessa had ordered every resident to surrender their phones at the clubhouse, and signed statements promising not to leave the neighborhood. Guards had used metal locking devices to immobilize the vehicles of anyone who objected, and Vanessa was telling residents that Grant intended to poison the water supply and cut off the electricity, a lie designed to justify her armed occupation of the community. Grant asked Nadine whether Vanessa held any authorization from the county or the state, and she answered that there was none, only a stack of papers bearing what appeared to be the county sheriff's signature. That single detail told Grant that Vanessa had likely forged documents from a public official, a discovery that turned a property dispute into a felony investigation waiting to happen. By mid-morning, Vanessa staged what she called an emergency executive session on the clubhouse lawn, seated nearly 2 meters above the gathered residents in her velvet throne, flanked by 2 guards, standing at attention like royal sentries. From that elevated perch, she read a list of self-invented decrees, a curfew beginning at 7 each evening, 1 designated person allowed to leave each household, mandatory vehicle inspections, a total ban on approaching Grant's property line, authority to seize generators, fuel, and food from any resident who resisted, and the threat of civil detention for anyone who refused to comply. Marla Keene, the association's vice president, tried to remind Vanessa that homeowners associations held no legal power to detain anyone, but Vanessa answered coldly that her authority now flowed from the emergency itself rather than from any outdated bylaws. Guards began searching vehicles at the gates, confiscating radios, cameras, and car keys from residents already flagged as troublemakers, and an elderly man named Raymond Pike, scheduled for a dialysis appointment, was turned away, simply because he had refused to sign a loyalty pledge to the emergency order, an incident Grant never witnessed directly, but one, Nadine secretly, recorded in its entirety. Grant attempted to contact a neighboring town using an amateur radio setup, transmitting his coordinates, the number of armed men inside the community, and his suspicion that public documents had been forged, but Troy's team detected the transmission and sent 2 guards climbing the fence onto Grant's property to locate the source. Rather than confront them, Grant let the men wander deeper into land equipped with hidden game cameras. And the footage that resulted showed guards trespassing while armed, cutting a padlock, damaging an antenna marking the location of the substation, and radioing back that the chairwoman wanted full control of the infrastructure before noon. Grant immediately began copying that footage onto multiple hard drives and transmitting duplicates through a satellite uplink he kept as a backup for exactly this kind of emergency. Meanwhile, inside the clubhouse, Elliot Granger, the association's longtime treasurer, confronted Vanessa about the nearly $190,000 she had withdrawn from the reserve fund without a valid vote to hire the private guards, and she responded by threatening him with property fines that could cost him his house with a single signature. Marla began to understand that Vanessa was no longer protecting the association at all. She was erasing a financial paper trail and forcing residents into obedience before the resort deal could be finalized. A guard arrived carrying the hidden game camera his team had discovered on Grant's land, and Vanessa stared directly into the lens before smashing it against the ground, unaware that 6 other cameras positioned nearby had already captured the entire scene from multiple angles. That single act of destruction meant to erase evidence, instead became evidence of its own time-stamped and geotagged sitting safely on a server she had no idea existed. Word soon reached Vanessa that representatives from the resort corporation would be arriving at 3 that afternoon, and she needed visible proof that the association controlled the road, the water, and the power before their inspection team drove up the mountain. She ordered Troy to send 8 guards directly to Grant's substation, with instructions to cut the locks, replace the control systems, hang association, ownership signage, and pressure Grant into signing a document transferring operational control, all while filming the encounter to fabricate the appearance of voluntary cooperation. Grant watched the convoy approach from a distance, and had already anticipated this exact move, locking the system remotely, disabling anything hazardous, and triggering an intrusion alert that transmitted directly to the state's power. Grid Operations Center. A safeguard he had quietly installed years earlier after a wildfire season, taught him how easily rural substations could become targets for theft or sabotage. When Troy reached the substation gate, he handed Grant an emergency requisition order, bearing what looked like Sheriff Dalton Reeves's official seal and signature. But Grant had worked alongside Dalton for years and recognized instantly that the signature was not authentic. Grant asked to photograph the document before anything further happened, but Troy refused and ordered his men to breach the gate using a tow chain attached to one of the trucks. As metal groaned and the gate buckled, Grant stood back and reminded the crew that this substation was part of state-licensed infrastructure, and tampering with it carried serious criminal consequences regardless of what paperwork they believed they were holding. Troy simply laughed and said Vanessa had assured him the sheriff himself was backing the association's actions, a claim that would soon prove catastrophically false. The guards pushed through the wreckage of the gate, and as one reached for the control panel, an automatic lockdown triggered, sending an alarm echoing across the entire valley just as Vanessa arrived aboard a golf cart decorated with association flags, her velvet chair strapped awkwardly into the blank cargo bed like a mobile throne. She announced that Grant's ownership rights were being temporarily revoked and produced a transfer document demanding his signature, and when he refused, she ordered Troy to restrain him. 2 guards gripped his arms, but Grant did not resist physically. Instead, he spoke calmly and clearly toward the nearest camera, stating that he did not consent to detention, did not consent to any transfer of property, and that everyone present was engaged in unlawful conduct. From a distance, Nadine recorded audio through a signal transmitter, while Marla, standing nearby, secretly began recording the confrontation on a second phone she had hidden from the guards collecting devices earlier that morning. In a moment of overconfidence, Vanessa personally signed a document stating that the association had taken control of the substation at 17 minutes past 11, unknowingly producing a written confession of infrastructure seizure, the exact piece of evidence Grant needed most. Almost immediately after she set down the pen, a warning panel on the substation lit up with the words, "State Infrastructure Security Alert transmitted," and for the first time that day, the confidence on Vanessa's face flickered. Grant was released only after Marla warned Troy that continued detention could constitute kidnapping under state law, and believing that Grant had been sufficiently intimidated, Vanessa allowed him to return home under watch. Inside his study, he opened the steel box that contained months of preparation, a plat map dating back to 1948 records, proving his rights to the road, and the water source letters from the association attempting to purchase his land. Emails in which Vanessa threatened to manufacture an emergency invoices for the private security contract, copies of the association's reserve account statements, financial records suggesting she had funneled money through a shell company, a draft contract, selling access rights to his own land, without his consent, an audio recording of her admitting that residents would accept anything if they were frightened enough. and a letter to the resort corporation in which she falsely claimed the association already controlled the substation. Elliot had quietly passed along part of this financial evidence days earlier, suspecting embezzlement but too afraid to expose it publicly on his own, having watched 2 previous board members lose their positions and their standing in the community simply for questioning where the association's money actually went. Grant had organized every document by date and category inside labeled folders, a habit left over from decades spent preparing infrastructure reports for state auditors. And he understood that scattered suspicion meant nothing in a courtroom, while an organized timeline meant everything. Grant contacted attorney Lenora Vance using a satellite phone, her voice calm and measured, even as she listened to him describe armed guards, a forged sheriff's signature, and a chairwoman ruling from a velvet throne, and she confirmed that the day's events likely amounted to forgery of a public document, unlawful detention, conspiracy to seize private property infrastructure, tampering, obstruction of emergency communication, misuse of association funds, witness, intimidation and impersonation of governmental authority. She added that she had already forwarded partial evidence to the state attorney general's office the day before, though officials needed proof that Vanessa had actually deployed armed personnel and falsified documents in the field, proof that Grant, without realizing it, had already spent the entire morning quietly assembling. Grant now had exactly that proof, and he uploaded footage from his cameras, Nadine's recordings, and the substation video directly to Lenora's secure server. Meanwhile, Vanessa ordered her guards to search Grant's house for what she called sabotage materials, and though Troy hesitated because they had no warrant, her threat to withhold payment pushed him forward. Marla secretly called to warn Grant that the guards were coming, but rather than flee, he placed the steel box in the middle of his living room, leaving behind only duplicate copies while the originals sat locked in a fireproof safe beneath his barn floor. Troy and 4 guards broke in, and when Grant asked whether they carried a court order, no one answered. They simply seized the box and carried it back to Vanessa, who opened it, laughed at the sight of the incriminating paperwork, and ordered it burned in the clubhouse fireplace. Unaware that a small tracking and recording device sewn into the lining continued transmitting everything she said, including her own words that once the police arrived, nothing would remain to prove any of it had happened. Lenora forwarded that recording directly to Colonel Wade Mercer of the State Patrol, and his response consisted of a single order: deploy the full unit. By early afternoon, conditions inside Kingsridge Preserve had deteriorated into chaos. Food supplies were rationed, the gates remained sealed, and the guards themselves had grown exhausted and resentful of Vanessa's constantly shifting commands, several of them muttering to one another that they had signed on for a standard property security shift, not an unpaid occupation, stretching well past the hours they had originally agreed to work. Children who normally played in the cul-de-sacs after school were kept indoors by anxious parents, and the low hum of generators mixed with the occasional crackle of a guard's radio created an atmosphere that felt less like a quiet mountain community and more like a neighborhood under siege from within. She demanded that every resident gather in the town square to swear loyalty to her emergency order, threatening a $10,000 fine and suspension of utility access for anyone who refused, while Nadine quietly encouraged residents to stay calm and let Vanessa continue speaking on camera for as long as possible, reminding the small cluster of frightened neighbors gathered near her porch that every extra minute of Vanessa's confident rambling was another minute of footage that would eventually be played back to a judge. Elliot brought his accounting records to Marla, revealing that Vanessa had withdrawn $190,000 for the guards, transferred $320,000 to a company owned by her cousin, spent $75,000 on the velvet chair, staging and sound system secured a promised commission of $2,400,000. If the resort deal closed, forged 3 board meeting minutes, and used Marla's electronic signature on contracts she had never approved. Marla realized she could easily be framed as an accomplice in a scheme she had never sanctioned, and as she flipped through page after page of transfers and forged approvals, bearing her own name, her hands began to shake with the growing understanding that she had trusted a woman who had been quietly preparing a fallback plan to blame her for months. She confronted Vanessa outside the clubhouse, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury as she demanded an explanation for the forged signatures bearing her own name, and rather than deny any of it, Vanessa declared coolly that great leaders never asked permission from weaker people. When Marla demanded the blockade end, immediately, Vanessa ordered Troy to detain her, and though he hesitated, Vanessa screamed that she held supreme authority over Kingsridge, and 2 guards locked Marla inside the meeting room. That single act frightened the remaining security team far more than anything before it, since they had been hired to guard property, not kidnap a sitting board member. And Troy quietly called his security company's management only to discover the contract had been signed under a company that did not legally exist, meaning Vanessa may never have hired any of them lawfully at all. Using an outdoor speaker system on his own land, Grant addressed the entire community, directly explaining that the guards were trespassing on private property, that Vanessa's orders carried no legal authority whatsoever, that anyone who lowered their weapons and stepped away would be recognized as having cooperated, that all evidence had already been sent to the state, and that continuing to hold residents against their will would only deepen the consequences waiting for them. Vanessa answered over her own bullhorn, calling Grant a rebel and ordering his house surrounded, but one guard named Preston Hale refused to comply, and when Vanessa slapped him across the face in front of everyone and demanded Troy strip him of his weapon, Preston removed his badge, set down his firearm, and walked over to stand with the residents instead. 3 more guards followed him within minutes, unclipping their radios and setting their equipment down in a neat row along the curb, as though some unspoken agreement had passed silently between them the moment Preston made the first move. Residents who had spent the entire day terrified now watched in stunned quiet as the very people hired to intimidate them began quietly walking away from the woman who had ordered it. Troy looked at Vanessa, then at the men abandoning their posts, and began to understand that the woman on the throne was preparing to let every bit of blame land squarely on him, since nothing in the fabricated paperwork she had shown him bore any signature but her own. In the distance, the low thrum of helicopter blades began rolling across the ridge, faint at first, then unmistakable, growing steadily louder with every passing second. Vanessa heard the helicopter, but assumed it carried the Resort Corporation's delegation, so she ordered her remaining guards to reform their lines, straighten their uniforms, and stand at attention before the clubhouse. Instead, the first sirens rose from the direction of the highway, and not one vehicle appeared but 12 state patrol cars, in a tight formation climbing the mountain road, trailed by the county sheriff's vehicle, an economic crimes unit, and an infrastructure response team, while a patrol helicopter circled overhead. Colonel Wade Mercer's voice cut through a loudspeaker, deep and unhurried, carrying the kind of authority no bullhorn on a golf cart could ever imitate, ordering every private security member to lower their weapons, step back from the barricades, and raise their hands. Vanessa immediately commanded Troy to hold the gate, insisting that state forces had no right to enter Kingsridge territory without her personal approval. But Troy stared at the wall of patrol cars and the forged contract clutched in his fist, and told his men not to fire under any circumstance. Vanessa grabbed a radio and screamed that anyone who abandoned their post would never see another paycheck, but Colonel Mercer repeated his warning a second time, and Preston stepped forward, first hands raised, pointing toward the exact location of the weapons his team had set down. One by one, the remaining guards followed his lead. Vanessa turned to Troy and demanded he take Grant hostage as a bargaining chip, but Troy flatly refused, and when she tried to snatch the stun gun from his belt herself, he held her wrist away and stepped back out of reach. The north gate finally swung open, and the convoy of patrol vehicles rolled through engines, idling in slow formation, as troopers stepped out in full gear, spreading across the entry road with the calm, practiced discipline of people who had trained for exactly this kind of confrontation, a stark and immediate contrast to the exhausted, uncertain guards who had spent the entire day taking orders from a woman on a chair. Grant stood near the entrance, handing Colonel Mercer his property deeds and verification codes for his land records, while Lenora arrived in a vehicle belonging to the State Attorney General's office. Sheriff Dalton Reeves examined the emergency requisition order bearing his forged signature and confirmed on the spot that he had never signed or authorized any such document. The ink, the seal, and even the file number were entirely fabricated. Vanessa, still seated on her throne above the clubhouse steps, demanded that the sheriff arrest Grant for inciting rebellion. Dalton climbed the stairs, held up the forged order, and asked her directly where she had obtained it. And Vanessa answered with total confidence that her authority did not require the county's blessing, since no one else present held sufficient power. When Dalton asked whether she was admitting to producing the document herself, she replied without hesitation that of course she had, since nobody else there possessed the necessary authority, and every word of that confession was captured by the body camera clipped to his vest. Colonel Mercer gave a signal, and 2 female troopers climbed the steps toward the velvet throne, but Vanessa refused to stand, insisting that no one was permitted to touch the chairwoman of Kingsridge. Colonel Mercer read the initial charges aloud in front of the crowd that had gathered: forgery of a government document, impersonation of executive authority, conspiracy to seize private property, organizing unlawful detention, obstructing a public roadway, tampering with critical infrastructure, destroying evidence, misappropriating association funds, and directing armed personnel to commit illegal acts. Vanessa laughed and claimed the board had granted her full immunity, but when Lenora asked her to point to the specific clause authorizing that immunity, Vanessa had nothing to offer, her eyes darting toward Marla and Elliot as though expecting one of them to rescue her with a fabricated document she had not yet prepared. The crowd of residents gathered at the base of the clubhouse steps watched with a mixture of disbelief and quiet vindication, many of them realizing only in that moment just how completely they had allowed one woman's confidence to substitute for actual legal authority. As the troopers moved to lift her from the chair, she gripped the armrests and shrieked for the residents to defend her, but not a single person moved. Marla, freed from the locked meeting room, walked out into the crowd and publicly confirmed that the board had never voted to declare any state of emergency. Elliot handed his financial records to the investigating officers, his hands steadier, now that the decision he had agonized over for weeks was finally out of his control. Nadine turned over the memory card containing footage of confiscated phones, detained residents, and threats issued under Bausenterliev. Vanessa's command in Troy surrendered the fraudulent security contract, along with a recording of Vanessa ordering him to take Grant hostage. One by one, the very people Vanessa had once controlled became the witnesses who dismantled her. She tried to shift the blame onto Troy, claiming he had deployed weapons on his own initiative, but Troy simply played back a recording of her own voice, ordering 24 armed men to every gate and declaring that no one would leave Kingsridge without her express permission. The two troopers finally pried her hands from the throne, and she kicked at the steps, knocking loose the decorative crown she had worn for the earlier contract signing. They turned her arms behind her back and secured the handcuffs, while the entire community watched in silence as Vanessa Crowley was pulled from the velvet chair she had built into a symbol of her own untouchable power. Even in handcuffs, she continued shouting that she alone was in charge, and Colonel Mercer answered simply without a trace of anger in his voice, that she did not govern a state, only a homeowners association, and even that modest role had just come to a permanent end. The empty throne remained on the makeshift stage, the forged martial law order tumbling across the steps in the wind as troopers escorted Vanessa toward a patrol car amid the sound of cameras and closing handcuffs. Just before the door shut behind her, she watched the resort corporation's delegation turn their vehicles around and drive back down the mountain, and the $38 million deal she had risked everything to protect collapsed right in front of her eyes. The investigation widened over the following weeks, drawing in forensic accountants, land use attorneys, and a small task force from the State Attorney General's office assigned specifically to untangle the financial web Vanessa had spent years constructing. It revealed that Vanessa had been planning the seizure of Grant's land for well over a year, establishing a shell company called Crowley Civic Protection to secretly contract with the very association she led. Money collected from residents had been funneled through 3 separate accounts before eventually landing in her personal finances. Digital records showed she had forged 17 board meeting minutes, issued 42 unauthorized penalty notices, threatened to seize 6 separate homes, siphoned more than $600,000 from the reserve fund, secured a promised commission worth $2,400,000, forged the county sheriff's signature, fabricated an entire emergency to manufacture false ownership claims, ordered evidence destroyed, and directed the detention of at least 9 residents against their will. Troy and his crew cooperated fully with investigators, spending long hours in interview rooms reconstructing exactly when and where each order had been given, and those who had surrendered early avoided criminal prosecution entirely. Their cooperation weighed heavily in their favor once prosecutors understood how quickly the operation had spiraled beyond anything resembling a legitimate security contract. Their company's operating license was suspended pending review, and several guards later admitted they had assumed the emergency declaration carried some genuine legal weight, since Vanessa had presented it with such unwavering certainty that questioning it had simply never occurred to them until residents began walking away in handcuffs of their own free will. Troy himself faced charges related to trespassing and unlawful detention but received significant leniency after refusing to take Grant hostage and voluntarily turning over crucial evidence. Marla resigned from the board in a short, unsentimental letter posted to every resident's mailbox, accepting responsibility for staying silent too long, even as her instincts warned her something was wrong. Yet she became one of the case's most important witnesses, proving in careful, methodical detail that Vanessa had forged the signatures of fellow board members without their knowledge. Elliot helped investigators trace every dollar. Nadine published a lengthy investigative account of how a homeowners association could collapse into something resembling authoritarian rule the moment residents stopped questioning where its power actually came from. Grant filed a civil suit demanding compensation for property damage repair costs for his gate, and substation damages for trespassing, damages for unlawful detention, attorney fees, a permanent injunction barring the association from ever approaching his land again, and the dissolution of every false claim the association had made to his road and reservoir. The court issued an emergency ruling confirming that the land, the road, the reservoir, and the substation belonged entirely to Grant, and the Homeowners Association was placed under temporary independent oversight while a court-appointed monitor reviewed every contract Vanessa had signed during her 3 years in office. The Velvet Throne itself was seized as physical evidence photographed from every angle by investigators, and later displayed in the courtroom during her hearing as a visual reminder of exactly how far a person could drift from the modest role she had originally been elected to fill. At her preliminary hearing, Vanessa appeared in a plain detention uniform stripped of makeup insignia and the armed escort she once commanded. Prosecutors placed before her a photograph of herself seated on the throne. 24 armed men arranged behind her like a private army. And when she dismissed it as merely a security demonstration, they played the recording of her own, voice ordering residents detained the substation, seized and evidence burned. The courtroom fell completely silent, and even the public defender assigned to represent her seemed to lean back slightly in his chair, as though physically distancing himself from the words coming out of the recording. Reporters who had once covered nothing more dramatic than local zoning disputes filled the gallery benches, sensing that the story of a homeowners association president who had declared martial law over a Montana mountainside would travel far beyond the county line. The judge denied her second request for bail after learning she had attempted to contact a witness and pressure them into changing their testimony, and for the first time in years, Vanessa Crowley had no one left to give orders to. 6 months later, Kings Ridge Preserve looked nothing like the community it had briefly become under Vanessa's rule. The checkpoints were dismantled, the unauthorized cameras removed, unjust fines refunded, and a new board elected under independent supervision took her place. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak up at meetings now attended in numbers the association had never seen before, asking pointed questions about budgets, contracts, and spending limits, determined never again to let a single person accumulate that much unchecked control. Nadine served as interim president, but refused every trapping of authority. Vanessa had once demanded holding her first meeting in an ordinary community room with no stage, no armed escort, and no chair raised above anyone else's, insisting instead on folding chairs arranged in a simple circle, so that everyone could see one another's faces while they spoke. Grant received full compensation for the damage done to his property along with his legal expenses, and the association signed a permanent agreement acknowledging that he had never belonged to Kingsridge, that the association held no claim whatsoever to his land, that the fire road could only be used in genuine emergencies, that the reservoir could never be sold or commercially developed, that any access to the substation required his written consent, and that association funds could never again be used to hire armed personnel without a lawful vote and proper approval. Copies of the agreement were posted publicly in the community newsletter and read aloud at the first open board meeting, a small but deliberate gesture meant to ensure that no future president could quietly bury the terms the way Vanessa had once buried every inconvenient bylaw. Vanessa faced numerous criminal charges and ultimately lost her home after her assets were frozen to repay the funds she had embezzled, and her shell company was dissolved entirely. The resort corporation abandoned its project for good. Grant used part of his settlement to modernize the fire road and the warning systems along it, but ownership and control remained entirely his own. In the final calm of an ordinary morning, Grant drove through the north gate of Kings Ridge Preserve, where steel barricades had once stood there. Now hung only a simple new sign reading "Private Property Emergency Access by Legal Authorization." Only. Beside the clubhouse, the platform that once held the Velvet Throne had been removed, leaving 4 empty bolt holes sunk into bare concrete. Nadine asked him whether he had felt any satisfaction watching Vanessa dragged in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood, and Grant considered the question for a long moment before answering that the image itself had never been the point, that watching someone fall from a chair she had no right to sit in provided only a brief and hollow kind of relief. What mattered more, he said, was everything that came after, when neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak in a meeting started showing up, asking questions and reading the fine print before signing anything ever again, because that was the moment everyone finally remembered that no title, no in uniform, and no chair could ever turn a lie into law. A state patrol vehicle passed by on the road below its driver, offering a brief wave before continuing down the mountain, a small gesture that would have meant nothing on an ordinary day, but now felt like quiet confirmation that the boundary between lawful authority and manufactured power had finally been restored. Grant pulled through his own gate, drove onto his land, and closed it quietly behind him. There were no guards left standing watch. There was no martial law left to enforce. There was no self-appointed queen left to give orders. Somewhere down the mountain, in a courtroom that would keep hearing evidence for months to come, Vanessa Crowley continued, insisting that she had only ever been trying to protect her community, even as prosecutors laid out exhibit by exhibit, exactly how far she had been willing to go to protect. Nothing but herself. There was only a clear boundary line, and a community that had finally learned that a homeowners association holds power only within the limits the law allows it. Vanessa had hired 24 armed guards to convince everyone around her that she stood above the law, and in the end, that same small army became 24 witnesses, to the day she was pulled down from the throne she had built. For herself,